Today's episode of Socially Democratic is now available on Patreon. Join our socially democratic community on Patreon for free or for as little as $2.50 a month, and you can help support the show so we can do more things like live shows and you can connect with fellow listeners across our social democratic community. And when you sign up as a campaign organiser, you get a Haters Gonna Hate and the Rest Vote Labor merch, as well as access to premium episodes and a free ticket to our next live show. So check the links in today's bio. Today's episode is also brought to you by Today's episode is also brought to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We only work with people who want to build power to make the world a better place. We develop community engagement strategies to win campaigns both big and small, and we train engagement staff and volunteers in the Gantt framework of leadership, organising and action. And if you want to create change in your community, then hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by Morris Blackburn Lawyers, Australia's #1 plaintiff law firm. Morris Blackburn believe the law should serve everyone and not just those that can afford it. And they've helped influenced some of Australia's most important legal decisions, including equal pay for women and Indigenous workers, and helped over 500,000 Aussies get compensation they deserve. Morris Blackburn Lawyers, experience you can count on. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast that drops every Friday morning and dives into the progressive campaigns of the day and people leading them from home and abroad. Today we're going to be speaking to Shireen Morris, who is an associate professor from Macquarie University's Radical Centre for Reform Lab, and she's just written a book called Broken Heart, and it's her reflections on the Voice Referendum. So we're going to talk to Shireen about that today. If you like the show, please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and leave us a review, and support the show by signing up to our Patreon page. And when you're done listening to the show, tell all your friends. And for everything else, follow us on Dunn Street's channels on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. All right. Let's get to today's episode. We are taping this one on a Wednesday morning on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. Before I introduce our guest for today's episode, just a reminder to folks, it's now September. Can't believe it's September. And just a heads up, we've got an absolute shitload of episodes coming that we've basically already kind of locked in. I'm in the States in the next 2 weeks, so we're going to be doing 2 episodes from the East Coast. We obviously, as some folks know, we lead a delegation of Aussies over to Washington and New York each year after Labor Day, US Labor Day, to meet with a whole bunch of folks from the Democrats and sort of progressive politics. So we're doing 2 episodes will come out of that. Then we're kind of moving into, obviously we'll do the Feeney Files at the end of each month, but then we're moving into October, and October is election season because we're going to do a preview of the ACT election. We're going to be doing multiple episodes previewing the Queensland election with 2 regular guests for that. So excited about that. And then obviously there's the small matter of the US presidential election, in which we're locking in some guests right now for that. And we'll be doing multiple episodes leading up to the US election. And then by that stage, we're into November. And then we're kind of wrapping up the year with our kind of end of year reviews and stuff. So there's a lot of things happening. Just wanted to flag that with everyone. And obviously for the Feeney File episodes, please subscribe to Patreon and send us your questions to put to David for our end of the month wrap of politics, both at home and abroad. Anyway, let's get down to business. Joining me on the line now is she's an author to start with, but she's also the associate professor at Macquarie Law School and the director of the Radical Centre Reform Lab. She's just written a book called Broken Heart, a history of the Voice Referendum, and she's joining us on the line from Melbourne now. Shireen Morris, welcome to Socially Democratic.
Hi, Stephen. Thanks heaps for having me.
So we're going to talk about the book in a moment, but before we do that, tell us a bit about yourself. Now, I know that you stood for the Labor Party at the, was it the last election?
It was 2019. I was the candidate for Deakin. Yeah, but I was actually on the Senate ticket in New South Wales at the last election as well.
Rightio. Okay, so you put your hand up, you sought public office, a very admirable thing. Unfortunately, you didn't get a win. But before you decided to do those kinds of things, tell us a bit more about yourself. What is this journey that's led you to being in this space of either working for the Labor Party in campaigns and doing stuff on the referendum for Aboriginal constitutional recognition?
Yeah, it's a strange journey, I think. I was born in Melbourne. I'm of Indian and Fijian Indian background. So my parents migrated from India via Fiji, came here in the 70s towards the end of the White Australia policy. I grew up here. And in my 20s, I was actually working as an actor and a singer. So I spent nothing to do with law or politics. I spent my summers doing Shakespeare in the Botanic Gardens in Melbourne and doing plays and singing in bands and songwriting and trying to get a record deal and all that kind of stuff. And then when I was about 28, I went back to university and studied law at Monash. And while I was doing that degree, I did this program called the Aurora Internship Program, which sends law students off to Indigenous organisations on their university holidays. And I had been reading stuff by the Aboriginal leader Noel Pearson, which I was finding compelling at the time. And I ended up going up to Cairns and volunteering over the summer at Cape York Institute, which is a Indigenous policy organisation run by Noel Pearson, towards the end of my law degree. And he must have been impressed with something I wrote. I wrote this paper on the Mabo decision. And he, out of the blue, said, Shireen, we want you to come up here and work with us on Indigenous constitutional recognition. That was way back in 2011. So long time ago. And it changed the whole trajectory of my life. So I packed up, moved up to Cairns, lived there for a couple of years. And basically I worked at Cape York Institute for 7 years, but I worked with Noel and other Indigenous leaders on constitutional recognition for about 12, 13 years now. And it ended up becoming the focus of my career, ended up becoming a constitutional lawyer. I did my PhD on the topic of a advisory body, a voice guaranteed by the Constitution. So the referendum in October last year was the very depressing end to a long, long journey of ups and downs for me in this space.
Okay, and we'll get to that. I've got a couple of questions. First of all, is where did this love of the theatre or being a thespian come from to begin with?
Where do these things ever come from? I really don't know. I used to love doing plays and stuff in primary school and high school. So I just enjoyed it. I enjoyed being on stage. And I think there's often a crossover with people who like words and people who like performing, people who like language and, Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I was just into it and then started auditioning for drama schools and that kind of thing after high school. I ended up studying acting in London and working in the UK for a couple of years in musicals and pantos at Christmas time and that kind of thing. Travelled around England a little bit doing that in my early 20s and then came back and, did it as my sort of main job, supplementing it with admin temping on the side, that kind of thing. But I used to love it like that. And look, maybe that's why I enjoy public speaking now and advocacy, and there's definitely some crossover there, I think.
Why did you love it?
Why did I love it? That's such a good question. I think being creative, loving words, loving music. One thing I really miss about that time in my life is I rarely find time to sing anymore. And there's something really physical that happens to you when you're singing and you're singing well, because I used to do singing training and all that kind of thing, but it's a little bit like sport. You're pumping oxygen into your body, so you leave a performance on a real high, lots of endorphins running, and there is something amazing about connecting with an audience, I think. Getting an audience to laugh, getting an audience to come along on the character's journey, using your voice and using your body and your face and your eyes to convey the emotions and to convey the subtext. And particularly when you're doing it with Shakespeare, there's so much there to play with I used to love the staple show in the Botanic Gardens used to be A Midsummer Night's Dream. I got to play Titania, the Queen of the Fairies. And it sort of had everything. It had movement, it had dance, and I was a crap dancer, so don't get me wrong. But, movement, dance mixed with that poetry, mixed with the comedy and the romance and the passion. I used to love it, yeah.
That's fantastic. When did you then have this moment where, I need to be a lawyer? Where did this come from?
I always used to be a bit of a geek at school. So I wasn't only a sort of thespian. I used to be academic and I used to enjoy that side of things as well. And I think I started to miss using my brain in that way. So as fun as performing was, I think the academic side of me was a bit undernourished, and I didn't know whether, I looked at my fellow actors and I kind of thought that maybe they were more into it than I was. So I started looking for something else. I wasn't sure that law was going to be it, but, I thought, let's study something else at the same time as doing these shows. And so that's what I did. I didn't in any way know that would take me into the world of law reform, constitutional reform and politics. That happened really unexpectedly. And the turning point really was the internship up at Cape York Institute and meeting Noel. That was my introduction into this whole new world of policy and politics and the way you might use advocacy and persuasion to kind of instigate and impel change. And that opened a real door in my mind. And suddenly I found something that I was perhaps going to be more passionate about even than performing.
Did you choose that internship up in Cape York? Did you choose that because of the subject matter, or was it just by happenstance that the internship you got, or did they choose you, or did you choose it?
I got to put down preferences. So certainly the whole Aurora program was about Indigenous rights.
So
if you're applying for that program, I was always interested in social justice, and that came from my parents. Indian, Fijian Indian background, like I said, came from relatively poor backgrounds. And as I was growing up, Mum would make comments to me like, "Oh, it's not fair the way Aboriginal people are treated in this country," for example. So when I was studying law, I was naturally drawn to those types of subjects that engaged matters of justice, equality, discrimination. Those were the kinds of subjects that I found most interesting. And that's what drew me to the internship. That's what got me reading Noel Pearson's work. And that's how I ended up there, really.
What was it that struck you from reading Noel Pearson's work that motivated you to invest your time into this particular area of focus in the law?
Look, it happened a lot later. My fascination with the radical centre really came from Noel. But, I thought that his writing was a voice that was fundamentally about progress and justice and reconciliation, but who was also prepared to say things that progressives weren't always prepared to say, prepared to make observations about some of the problems in Aboriginal communities that could sometimes be challenging for those on the left to hear. And just instinctively, I found that compelling, and his insights about the need to work across left and right and to try to get at the truth in vexing policy problems, regardless of some of the orthodoxies that come from the left and right. Intellectually, I found that really stimulating. And he's a compelling speaker and writer, right? So that was something I was drawn to. I didn't have any idea that constitutional recognition was even a thing, though. I went up there, as I said, there was the Wild Rivers controversy at that time, leading into that time. So they had me working on stuff to do with, environmental legislation, how that interacts with Aboriginal property rights. that got me looking at the Mabo decision and thinking about, hang on, how come these High Court judges correctly overturned terra nullius and yet then went on to inadvertently recognise and allocate Indigenous property rights in a kind of inferior and discriminatory way? You know, like the native title was a weak bundle of property rights when compared to sort of mainstream property rights. And I was sort of questioning that and interrogating why that might be the case, trying to challenge that. And yeah, that's what Noel must have thought. Okay, let's see what Shireen can do in the topic of constitutional recognition. But that was a completely new thing for me, thinking about those things.
When was the moment that, or moments for you personally, when you said, right, I think this is actually where I want to invest my time and energies and resources into this particular line of work? When was that fork in the road? You're like, okay, this is what I'm going to do.
Well, you know, we went on an extraordinary journey. So I started working at Cape York Institute in 2011.
How old were you then?
Coming from my social justice background, looking at the constitutional reform debate, I sort of was keen on this idea that there should be a racial non-discrimination guarantee in the Constitution, an equality guarantee, the kind that lots of other constitutions have. There was a big roadblock to us pushing that idea. You know, the expert panel adopted that idea that Noel was sitting on at that time. And then there was this massive pushback from the political right. And Noel kind of said to me, Shireen, we need to rethink this whole thing. Bipartisan support is crucial, and we don't have the support of the right for this racial non-discrimination guarantee idea. So we need to find a way to rethink this whole issue, right? And that led me on this journey of engaging with the conservatives, the constitutional conservatives who were slamming us most hard for that proposal. And through that engagement across divides, this alternative idea germinated, which was the idea of a constitutionally guaranteed Indigenous advisory body, later to be known as the Voice. And it was that experience, I think, to answer your question, Stephen, it was that experience of really reaching out to those who we passionately disagreed with, nutting out how to achieve common ground, coming up with a unique, different solution that addressed the competing concerns in a way that also genuinely addressed long-standing Indigenous aspirations for empowering constitutional reform. You know, once I'd been through that process, and that was in sort of 2014, that was sort of life-changing and eye-opening for me. And because of the role I played in that, from that moment I felt committed, you know. And over the following years, 3 years later in 2017, the Uluru Statement sort of saw Indigenous consensus land on that proposal of a constitutionally guaranteed Indigenous advisory body, and then coalition resistance to that over the following years. And then finally, in 2022, the Labor Party gets elected, then it becomes government policy and a referendum, you know. So I sort of saw that outlier idea slowly gain wider and wider consensus, slowly gain traction. And I felt personally invested, you know, I wanted to see it succeed.
You mentioned the term racial non-discrimination guarantee. What is it? What does that actually mean?
Yeah, so Australia's constitution is different to most other Western democracies around the world because we don't have a Bill of Rights, right? At the federal level, we don't have a Bill of Rights. Most other constitutions of similar countries have Bill of Rights that says, you know, free speech is guaranteed, equality before the law is guaranteed, which means laws are not allowed to discriminate on the basis of race, sex, etc., with certain exceptions. Australia doesn't have any of that. In fact, our constitution has clauses in there saying that racial discrimination is basically allowed, right? We've still got clauses in there saying that. So what we pushed back in 2011, when Noel was sitting on the expert panel that Julia Gillard put together at that time, we pushed that for that to be corrected through the insertion of a racial non-discrimination guarantee in the Constitution. So basically, equality before the law. No law shall discriminate on the basis of race, making exception for policies to address, historical disadvantage, native title, closing the gap, etc. That's what that was all about.
Okay, so let's turn to the book. My first question is, why did you want to write this book?
Yeah, as I saw the campaign playing out in 2023 for the referendum, and as I watched the voting results coming in on the 14th of October last year, this narrative kept repeating in the public discussion. And it's a completely prolific narrative that seems to have been adopted by, certainly by right-wing commentators, but even by left-leaning commentators, frankly. And the narrative has been that this was a no-compromise referendum, This was crash or crash through, to use the phrase repeated by Jesuit priest Frank Brennan. And the narrative was that this failed because Indigenous leaders and the Labor government failed to compromise. That's why bipartisanship wasn't achieved. That's why the referendum failed. It was all Indigenous leaders' fault and the Labor government's fault. I think that narrative is incorrect and completely inverts the reality. I don't deny in any way that the Labor government made mistakes in the referendum campaign and the way they presented things and ran things. There absolutely were mistakes, which I talk about in some detail in the book. But what gets lost is that the coalition decided to kill this, The coalition decided to oppose a proposal that for a constitutionally guaranteed advisory body that had actually been developed by Indigenous leaders in collaboration with Conservatives, including a Liberal Party parliamentarian, Julian Leeser, when he worked with us on the Voice proposal back in 2014, he later went on to be a Liberal Party politician. So the coalition decided to oppose something that Indigenous leaders had developed with right-leaning thinkers for the purposes of securing bipartisan support. They nonetheless decided to oppose this primarily for political and electoral gain.
Do you think that the right and wrong use of word there, because I mean the correct Liberal Conservatives brought into this conversation in the initial negotiations, like way back, even well before we were in the process of...
So in terms of the individuals that we were talking to...
Yeah, you know this Julian Leeser guy, but I mean, like, in the end, you know how politics works. If it's not the right people in the room, that person's not going to be able to carry the can when they go back into that group or caucus or whatever it may be. And, did that person or those people that were in those conversations, did they actually represent the views of, conservative viewpoint or ideology, or the Liberal Party for that matter?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think at the time they were the right people to start off small, right? So you can't sort of create a huge array of consensus in the first instance, So this was the first little ginger group of, is it possible to reconcile the competing concerns here? And the people we engaged with were constitutional conservatives, right? So Julian Leeser, Professor Greg Craven, Damien Freeman, and the very respected black-letter constitutional lawyer, Professor Anne Toomey. Those were the people that we sought to find common ground with in the first instance. That we always understood, though, that once you could find a proposal that answers the competing concerns, that, Indigenous people can say, yes, this advances our interests, it gives us a guaranteed voice in the Constitution, and constitutional conservatives who are most prolific in running no campaigns against this kind of, against constitutional reform. But on this, they're saying, actually, we support this because this upholds the Constitution. This works with the Constitution and respects parliamentary supremacy. So that was the initial sort of alliance, the initial bit of common ground. But of course, you're absolutely right. It couldn't stop there. It needed to then grow from there, It needed to, and on the Indigenous side, it certainly grew, because a few years later we saw the Uluru Statement happen. So there was this first ever national Indigenous consensus on how they want to be constitutionally recognised. But as you correctly point out, it never grew properly on the right, Nonetheless,
why not though?
Yeah, and I think that's a crucial question that I grapple with in the book. And what we experienced, Noel and myself, over many, many years was going and talking to Liberal and national politicians and key leaders expressing support for this proposal to us privately and then opposing it in public, right? So I don't have a clear answer on why it couldn't grow on the right, but I think part of the answer is petty politics. When people are prepared to privately support something, but when political circumstances change, their view changes. And we experienced that sort of time and again over many years. To give you an example, in 2015, we met with Malcolm Turnbull before he became Prime Minister. He said, this sounds like a sensible proposal to us in private. 3 months later, he overthrew Tony Abbott and seized the Prime Ministership. Now, when the Uluru Statement happened, Malcolm Turnbull expressed his preference only for symbolism. He sort of wouldn't countenance anything other than symbolism during the dialogues leading into the Uluru Statement. And then a couple of months after the Uluru Statement was issued, he publicly came out and said, no, we reject this. This is a third chamber. So completely different to the indications that he'd given privately. Tony Abbott was another person who expressed private support and openness towards this idea. But when Turnbull opposed this, he joined him. Christian Porter was another one. So I think on the coalition side, unfortunately, although there were private indications of support growing, and although there were outlier individuals like Julian Leeser, Bridget Archer, Andrew Bragg, people who supported a constitutionally guaranteed voice, really the official position never budged on the coalition side from wanting only symbolism. And that's why I say the narrative is inverted, right? Because it wasn't Indigenous people failing to compromise. Indigenous people shifted from a racial non-discrimination guarantee. No, the right's opposing that. Okay, let's shift to a constitutionally guaranteed voice. Okay, the right's opposing that. Let's shift the constitutional drafting. Let's make it more modest over the 9 years that I've witnessed this debate. So Indigenous people are constantly shifting, compromising, trying to win coalition support for something more than just symbolism. But the coalition never really budged from saying, well, we're only offering symbolism or nothing.
Even if you've got symbolism, they're probably going to flip on that as well. I just want to get a sense of, in reflection, was there anything that could have been achieved to get those characters that you named at the time, and Turnbull being obviously the crucial one at the time because he was the Prime Minister, to move? What could you have done to get him to move from saying privately, I support the spirit of what this is, to then publicly coming out and saying, okay, this is something that we can, as a political party, as the leader of the country, but also leader of the Liberal Party and conservative politics, this is what we can get behind?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And in the book, I pinpoint a key moment, I think, that there were lots of lost opportunities, over so many years of this debate playing out. One moment was when the Uluru Statement was issued in 2017, and the Referendum Council that oversaw those dialogues issued its final report in 2017. That final report recommended a constitutionally guaranteed voice, constitutionally guaranteed Indigenous advisory body. What it didn't include, that report, was any specific constitutional amendment, unfortunately, right? So the report recommended this concept and didn't recommend specific drafting to go into the Constitution. That kind of allowed the right to fearmonger because there was this lack of specificity. You could call it a third chamber, you could call it these things, and it was hard to refute because there was no drafting that people could point to. That was a missed opportunity because there was drafting that had been developed with these constitutional conservatives back in 2014. The Referendum Council probably should have included that. At the same time, right, Turnbull, I think, showed a real serious lack of leadership and responsibility at that key moment because he, as the Prime Minister of the country, could have convened a process, a bipartisan process where political representatives could sit down with Indigenous leaders and say, hey, let's draft this thing together. So huge missed opportunity because the Referendum Council probably should have pushed for something like that. But failing that, if Turnbull had some goodwill, he could have instigated that kind of a process so that something could be developed with the coalition at the table, you know? He didn't. Instead, he went out there calling it a third chamber, saying Australians will never support this, which was in contradiction to polls at the time saying around 60% of Australians support the concept. You know, so faced with polls saying 60% of Australians support this concept, he really should have shown leadership and sat down with Indigenous people and nutted out something that the coalition could live with. And that is what never happened in all these years. And, you know, partly I think, well, a large part of the reason must be that the coalition was in charge for most of that time and they never wanted that kind of a process to happen, I can only assume, because they didn't want to find common ground on this issue. They didn't want to take this forward. So there was this fundamental failure, I think, on the right to own this idea that had been developed by Indigenous leaders in collaboration with their own people. But there was a failure to own it, embrace it, refine it, make it their own. And as a result, it eventually got owned by Labor in 2023.
Let's turn to the other side of the equation. So we've looked at what was going on the Conservative side, but you obviously mentioned just before, and I want to unpack this more for our listeners because perhaps some of us aren't completely clear on this, but the work that was done by Indigenous Australians leading up to and then the Uluru Statement of the Heart, because that in itself was quite significant. Just talk to us a bit about the background of leading up to that and then what came out of what exactly is the Uluru Statement of the Heart.
Yeah, so it was an extraordinary process, one that had never been undertaken in this country before. You know, for the first time ever, extensive consultations, First Nations dialogues were held all around the country. This is 2016 to 2017, where Indigenous people could talk to each other about how they wanted to be constitutionally recognised. And in those dialogues, they discussed all the options that had been on the table at that point, right? So they discussed this idea of a racial non-discrimination guarantee that I talked about before. They discussed the idea of just a symbolic mention in the Constitution, which was how most of the politicians, you know, Howard, remember that he did the Republic referendum in 1999. It failed. He also had a preamble proposed, new preamble that would symbolically recognise Indigenous people. That failed as well. So they talked about this option of, do we want something just symbolic? And they talked about this idea, this relatively new idea of a constitutionally guaranteed Indigenous advisory body or voice, and the idea of agreement making, treaty making as well. And what those dialogues sort of almost unanimously landed on was that they wanted to be constitutionally recognised through a guaranteed voice, an Indigenous advisory body that would be guaranteed by the Constitution. And the other thing that they wanted was agreement making, treaty making, which didn't require constitutional change. A Makarrata Commission could be set up just in legislation. And that was the first time ever that Indigenous people had forged a national majority consensus on how they wanted to be constitutionally recognised. Of course, there were dissenters. So at the final Constitutional Convention in May 2017, there were 250 Indigenous delegates. Of those, 7 walked out, dissented, said, no, we don't agree. The now Senator Lydia Thorpe was among those 7 dissenters. So you just think about those numbers, right? 250 minus 7, that's something like a 97% Indigenous consensus. That's pretty amazing. You know, you think about the diversity of Indigenous Australia, north, south, urban, regional, remote, cultural differences, personality differences, political differences, yet 97% of delegates who had been chosen by their Indigenous colleagues around the country, they said, no, we want a voice guaranteed in the Constitution. So that was a significant moment which had never happened before in Australia. And the extraordinary thing about it was that Indigenous Australia landed on a modest compromise proposal that had been pragmatically forged by Indigenous leaders like Noel and others with constitutional conservatives, with the aim of building bipartisan support for this. So that was a massive opportunity which the Turnbull government in 2017 unfortunately completely blew apart.
So can I pose to you the alternate view of this and how to apply what came out of the Uluru Statement of Heart, and by going to what's happening in Victoria right now? And so my question will be, why enshrine it into the Constitution? Because for our Victorian listeners, they'll be aware that right now in this state, we are on this historic journey. The Victorian State Parliament, when Daniel Andrews was Premier, passed legislation to enact a body which has now become the First People's Assembly of Victoria, a democratically elected body that ran through 2 sets of elections. They've built their own list of Aboriginal citizens that are eligible to vote for Assembly members, and those Assembly members are now working through both the Truth-Telling Yuruk Commission and also about to negotiate. And the timeline is now September. In fact, we are in September, so it's like actually it's this month or next month. They're about to go. The leadership of that democratically elected assembly are about to go negotiate with the Victorian state government the first of many treaties. So what is meant to be happening out of Uluru is actually happening in Victoria. Why did they choose the path to want to enshrine this voice, so which effectively would be the Victorian First People's Assembly? Why do they want to enshrine that in the Constitution as opposed to going down a legislative path with what has happened in Victoria?
Well, so there's 2 things to understand. Firstly, this was always a conversation about constitutional recognition. How should Indigenous peoples be recognised in the Australian Constitution, right? So that's why changing the Constitution was part of this conversation, and has been for so long, and was part of the discussion when the Referendum Council was doing its work that led to the Uluru Statement, right? That's why it was called a Referendum Council, because this is about recognising them in the Constitution, and you need a referendum to change the Constitution. But the second reason Indigenous people asked for this body to be constitutionally guaranteed was so that it would be enduring. You know, you think about the merely legislated bodies of the past, like ATSIC, for example. As soon as they become politically inconvenient, or the government might change, or they become a political football, they can easily become get abolished through simple legislative change. You've even got the more recent Indigenous Advisory Council that was set up by Tony Abbott, that was just set up in policy, not even legislation, it doesn't operate anymore. So security, longevity, a sense of permanence. That's why Indigenous people asked for their voice to be constitutionally guaranteed. Because, the late Yunupingu, the great leader who passed away recently, he explained it well. He said, we want serious constitutional reform because we want our rights to be permanently recognised. We don't want our rights trampled at the whim of short-term political expediency. And Indigenous people have got this long history of experiencing that, So that's the key thing that was being sought here, was a voice, a body that would be enduring even if governments change, and that would carry the endorsement of the Australian people if the referendum had been successful. Yeah, so it would have been more permanent, and hopefully it would have been more authoritative had it succeeded at a referendum, and hopefully effective as well. So that is the risk with any legislative reform, is that future governments and future parliaments can abolish and undo what was created.
To that point, obviously, if the Liberals ever win an election in Victoria again, they can legislate to remove the First Peoples of Assembly here in Victoria. Having said that, though, up until the loss in the referendum campaign, there was bipartisan support for what was going on in Victoria by both the National Party and the Liberal Party. They've now, if my stats are correct, I think they've now moved on that, but only because of what happened in the referendum, which is an interesting insight as well to see the actual lasting impact that this referendum has had on both advancing the rights of Aboriginal citizens, but also the notion of bipartisan support on this question. But in terms of being strategic goals focused in trying to create change, is it not true though that even though a Victorian Liberal government could just remove the Assembly, and we don't want that to happen, but by the time that they do that we've already got treaties signed in Victoria which are binding, which means that we then can start to begin to create lasting change for Aboriginal people in this, particularly in this state. Looking at it from a strategic standpoint, I appreciate that they want to see things being enshrined in the Constitution, but ultimately what we want really is to change people's lives. And is there not an argument to be made that in Victoria that's actually just going to happen regardless of enshrining something in the Constitution? I just want to just being a devil's advocate here for you, Shireen, but I just want to get your reflections on that.
Yeah, I think the hope should be in Victoria and other places that hopefully it will get bipartisan support, Hopefully over time it will work well, and the treaties will be respected, and that, the future Liberal governments, if they ever get elected, will not seek to undermine these things. So I completely accept that point. But that is the risk based on real lived experience that Indigenous people were seeking to address, because they lived through ATSIC being abolished. They lived through their rights being legislated by one government and then watered down by another government, like with the WIC 10-point plan, for example. So it is a real experience that Indigenous people were coming to the table with, and there was this opportunity. The whole conversation was about changing the Constitution. So the question then becomes, well, how do you want to change the Constitution? The question was not what legislative reform do you want. Let's be clear about that. The question was, how do you want to change the Constitution to recognise Indigenous peoples? And what the Uluru Statement said was, well, we don't want just a symbolic mention that delivers us nothing substantive. We don't want that. And Indigenous advocates have been consistent with that message. They said, we want something that delivers tangible results. And I think they very pragmatically opted not for a symbolic mention that would have no practical impact, not for a racial non-discrimination guarantee, which the right were never going to support, but for a proposal that had been developed with key players on the right in the hopes that bipartisanship could be achieved. So they were coming to the table in good faith, trying to put forward something pragmatic and modest that will deliver something for their communities while also speaking to conservative concerns. Of course, we can say in retrospect now, with the benefit of hindsight, that that strategy was misguided. But truly, I think the coalition missed a huge historic opportunity to do something so great for the nation, to do something great for Indigenous people, great for the nation. And it came from their side of politics. So that's, I think, what was sad about this story.
And well written within your book as well. Let's turn to the campaign itself. This is a campaign podcast after all. And so I wanted to sort of get your reflections from what you wrote in the book about the campaign itself. So obviously there's been a lot of effort to try and seek bipartisan support. Labor wins government. Albo makes the big announcement on election night. We're all dubious about, not dubious. We are all joyous in the election of finally Labor's being returned to the government benches at a federal level, and Albo, in this joyous moment, announces that there will be a voice to Parliament. What were your reflections on the campaign itself? I've made a couple of notes myself here that I want to sort of share, but I actually want to hear from you first of all, because I'm just keen to get a sense of what you thought worked within the campaign, but also what didn't.
Well, just to make the initial point that I think Albanese, when he got elected, announcing that he would hold a referendum on the voice was probably not the best way to open the door to bipartisanship, because he immediately associated it with Labor's victory in the referendum. Perhaps in retrospect, it would have been better to announce a bipartisan process, a week later or something like that. I would make the same observation about when Albanese announced the draft wording of the constitutional change at Gama in, I think it was July 2022. He announced wording, and I think he had the Indigenous MPs around him, gave a speech. There was no sense of an effort to do this jointly with the coalition. Now, perhaps that was because the coalition were wholly resistant. Nonetheless, Julian Leeser was up there at Gama, and as I reflect in the book, he was actually a co-creator of this proposal. He's been an advocate of a voice in the Constitution since 2014, much longer than Albanese. He was at Gama, and although Albanese acknowledged Leeser in the speech, he kind of was nowhere to be seen, So the sense of partnership was missing. I think that was a missed opportunity by the Labor government to do everything it could to drag the coalition on side, to position this as a joint effort, to welcome them, to compel, to make it politically difficult for them to oppose. Because think about it. If Lisa's involvement had been promoted from day one, it might have been much harder for the coalition to do what they did. In terms of the campaign itself, it was a messy debate because it was partisan. From the moment the Nationals opposed it, then the Liberals later opposed it as well. This was divisive, messy debate. And I think broadly, watching it unfold, the progressive movements, I think, have a huge job ahead of them in terms of how to prosecute sensible reform, nuanced reform in an age of really polarised politics and knowing the impacts that social media have on democratic debate. I felt that there was this strange feeling that campaigners for the yes side somehow thought that social media would work in their favour, which was extraordinary because I thought everybody knew that, no, social media, will amplify hate and division and negativity and lies. Social media will favour the negative, it'll favour the no side. And that turned out to be really true. So I think progressive politics needs to grapple with this. How do you prosecute nuanced, sensible reform? How do you truthfully explain a reform in this age of extreme polarization and messy online debate? So I think the campaign, was lacking in those respects.
Let me throw a couple of sort of reflections that I have from the campaign, and they're not necessarily just my reflections as well, but it's certainly, I'm a campaigner. That's my job. That's what pays the bills. And I hang out with campaigners all the time. And so we've all been sitting around in, coffee shops and bars and, online and WhatsApp groups since the referendum, and all talked about our own reflections on the campaign. So these reflections that I'm going to give you are not just mine, but from various people. And so jump on a bunch of these that you want to sort of either that you did pick up in the book or you sort of want to share an opinion on. And the first one was the leadership of the campaign itself. It was kind of like sometimes it was Albo was the leader, but sometimes Mark Dreyfus was the leader, the spokesperson, right? Campaigns need a spokesperson. I get referendums are weird because you're arguing for a set of words, not trying to elect people. But nonetheless, campaigns always need spokespeople to be up the front. And it was confusing and inconsistent as to who were those spokespeople. Sometimes Albo was saying that sometimes Albo performed as if he was a spokesperson for the campaign, but then other times said, no, I'm not, this is not my campaign. This is the First People's campaign. So there was this kind of, are you in or you out kind of view?
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree with that, Stephen. Observing it as it was playing out, it was hard to pinpoint, and I say this in the book, it was hard to see who was the general here, who was the leader that was pumping in the requisite energy, attention, meticulous drive to this task. From an inside perspective, it was hard to see. We couldn't see who this person was in the government. They didn't seem to exist. And yet, achieving a referendum, only not 8 out of 45 referendums have succeeded since 1901. It's the hardest thing to do. Politically, it's so difficult. And yet, as you say, there was this kind of are you in or you out feeling. There wasn't the requisite attention to the task. And at key moments when things really needed to be coherently explained to the public by the government, the explanations were missing. Perhaps because of this, as you say, lack of key spokesperson. There was no one whose job it was to clearly explain what needed to be explained to the public in each moment.
And then contrasting that within the No campaign, I mean, it took them a while to sort of settle on it. There wasn't, I don't think it certainly happened from the get-go, but eventually they settled on 2 key people who were both Aboriginal that were always doing all the talking. So it was such a contrast between white elite politician versus what was perceived as, Warren Mundine wasn't a household name. Jacinta Price wasn't a household name. By the end, people were like, those are the 2 people that are telling us what to do. And I guess if you're not really completely invested in what's going on here, but you're looking for some advice, you're probably going to take the advice of the black person as opposed to the white politician. And that, in the end, that contrast became that. So the second point about it as well, I've always been of the view in political campaigns, your job as the top of the ticket is you are the explainer in chief. If you can't explain the core narrative, then you're in trouble. That's partly the reason why the Democratic Party said to President Joe Biden, Joe, we love your service for what you've done over the multiple decades to public life, but you can no longer explain why we need to re-elect a Democratic president and Senate and Congress. Hence why we need to get a new person to explain it. Basically, that's why they would settle on someone like Kamala Harris is doing a great job. Second point I want to make is, second reflection, the message. What are your reflections on exactly what was the core value frame that was to the people of Australia? Because I think that throughout the entire campaign, that they were constantly testing different central messages, and it never really cut through. And I want to get your reflections on that, because sometimes it can be, when you get a bunch of lawyers in a room to then try and communicate something, if you can't come down to a crystal clear message, then your campaign's in trouble from day one. And I want to get your thoughts on that.
I think that's a fair observation as well, definitely. And you think about what the cut-through message of the No campaign was: this will divide us by race, So that was cut through, and it had the added sort of benefit in the online environment of being sort of negative and having the characteristics of something that people would click on. It has the propensity to go viral. So there were a few factors there that I think are worth reflecting on. One is that the Yes campaign had to be truthful, right? Which kind of weighs against sharp, simple, soundbite messages. If you have to accurately and honestly explain what is in truth a nuanced reform, and it's nuanced, it is admittedly, it is harder to just have a simple 10-second soundbite accurate reflection of what it is you're proposing. So in a way, the yes case had a harder job, right? Whereas the no case could rely on, this will divide us by race. This is a third chamber, whatever it was. Didn't have to be truthful, could be negative. Whereas the yes side, advisors were constantly telling campaigners, you've got to stay positive, you've got to, all of these things. All that weighed in favour of no campaign cut through. And as you say, I think it's a fair criticism that there were probably too many messages being tested along the way, and no one simple cut through message that could compete with the no campaign's message. But I would also say that, and you're right, that a bunch of lawyers in a room probably aren't the right people to come up with the cut through message. But that is the reality of law reform, right? You come up with a sensible, good proposal, then people need to think about, how do we sell this? How do we best sell this? And that piece, I think, didn't happen properly. But how do you think it should have been sold?
That's a great question, and I'll come to the next point in a moment. It's one thing I actually want to do one day for the podcast is I want to get a bunch of campaign communication specialists or practitioners and a bunch of policy people, and then let them have at it, because these are the two groups that can never, ever agree on stuff, because the policy people do all of this really incredibly important, deep, detailed work, and then they give it to the communication people, and then the communication people just look at it and go, right, I'll grab that sentence and change it into a values frame and then shit it out. And then the policy people are like, no, don't do that, you're ruining my work. I'm going, dude, if you want to get it up, no one's going to read this friggin' Bible that you just literally wanted to shit out on social media. The only way we're going to get it is by getting it down to a crystal clear message that is a meaningful benefit for that voter, and that's what's going to change their mind. And so one day I want to have like this sort of, Beyond Thunderdome podcast where I can get two groups and they can just, beat the shit out of each other on a podcast. But anyway, leaving that to one side. Look, I don't have the answers to that because that's not my area of expertise, but I do want to get to a point now about areas of expertise. If I could, in baseball, right? There's the All-Star game where they pick the best of the best players to compete in this game each June. In political campaigning, particularly in referendums, there is this unique moment where you can have an all-star game where you pick the best of the best political campaigners from all the different sides to come together and run this campaign and try and win against who would be the best of the best in all. It's a very unique thing, right? Because normally our elections are partisan, and so therefore it's just red versus blue. If I was to be on the selection panel to pick the all-star team for the Yes campaign, I would. And I've had a lot of conversations with different folks. Out of the best for digital, the best of the best for field organising, the best of the best for communications, the best of the best for research, the best of the best for fundraising, I would, if you picked a team of 10, and I think the majority of those people would be from the Labor Party, I reckon the majority of those people were never, ever approached by the Yes campaign to be involved in their campaign. And the people I did see on that campaign were like former Rudd staffers who would have dusted off their 2007 election campaign strategy and said, let's go again. Whereas campaigns are constantly evolving. Each election cycle, we're updating and trying to evolve and improve the way that we campaign. And I just wonder about the staff that were on this campaign meant that we were set up to fail from the get-go.
That's a fascinating insight. And I don't know enough about who the best of the best are in this space to comment. But hearing you say that is really interesting. And look, I wasn't part of the formal Yes campaign, so I don't know how the people were chosen. But as a sort of looking from the outside, it looked like experienced political operatives from the left and right were in key positions. That's sort of what it looked like to me. Obviously, you might know more about who the best of the best are, but I don't know. I don't know why the Yes campaign wasn't stronger in some of these key aspects. But I return to my fundamental point that if both sides of politics had supported this, it would have been a different story, right? Because the Yes message would have not been competing against such a prolific No message. Mm-hmm. So I think there are a few stages there that much more effort needed to be put into ensuring that bipartisanship was there. And then, I reflect on this in the book as well. The moment that it was clear was sometime in, I think, April 2023, when Peter Dutton decided to formalise his opposition. And then by June, the polls had dropped such that the No case was ahead and the Yes case was behind. At that point, I still don't know why a decision wasn't made by the Labor government that this shouldn't go ahead. Because sometime after then, it became clear that this couldn't be turned around, So in retrospect, I think perhaps it was the wrong thing to do to keep going past that point, because as you've reflected, it's had wide political ramifications, really bad for the country, bad for the Indigenous cause. It's set us back. But I have to admit, I wasn't running around telling people that to cancel it either. So it's only in retrospect that I can look back and say, how did we all go ahead with this, absent the bipartisanship that had been the focus of Noel and my strategy for over a decade? How did that happen? And that's an unanswered question that the book grapples with. But I think, the Labor government, they must have made a decision at some point to go ahead even though it was going to fail.
It was, I remember being up in Canberra it was in winter, so I remember it was freaking freezing, and I was talking to someone senior person within the Labor Party campaign world. And we were just having a beer and I said, this looks cooked. And either delay I don't think the date had been announced yet. And that's the other thing. Running a campaign when you control the date, the greatest resource you have in a political campaign is time. It is the number one resource you have available to yourself. And if you can control the time, then that's a resource you control. And then not knowing when the date was, but then this debate about when would the date be, and looking at the way the polls were going, I was I don't know if you'd go now. Clearly it needs more time. And even just talking from a campaigner's perspective, the campaign really wasn't that set, the Yes campaign. Whereas I got a sense that the No campaign had started to sort of coalesce. And look, Shireen, I'll say to you this, the No campaign wasn't that great. We give too much credit to the No campaign. They kind of got their shit together late in the game. There was obviously a lot of mainstream media that was turning the tide because there was an absence of a clear message and a clear carrier of that message in the early days. That sort of, from the summer of 2023 or whatever it was through to sort of that winter. But the No campaign wasn't particularly good to start with. They were fiddling around trying to work out what they were doing as well. So there was an opportunity to turn it around. But to your point, why they still persisted with that timeline is something that, we probably need an answer on, I guess. Well, a bit too late now, but for reflection anyway, I think we do need an answer on that. You talked more about sort of the impact that this campaign had, and I want to get your final reflections on it overall, maybe starting off with the impact that it had on the overall goal here of trying to, reconcile our relationship with our First Peoples, our Indigenous brothers and sisters, and the impact that's going to have. Can I get your sort of reflections on that? And then I want to ask you more broadly about what's the point of referendums.
Yeah, look, it was a really sad end to a long 100-year plus effort by Indigenous advocates around the country asking to have their rights recognised in the Constitution, and 15 years of processes narrowing down how they wanted to do that. And the way the way the campaign and the debate played out really should be causing us all to reflect in terms of the health of our democracy. Like, look at the tenor of the discussion. I mean, really, there have been a lot of claims from the right after the referendum result that racism played no role. I'm sorry, that's just not true. I'm not saying it was the main reason. There were myriad complex reasons the referendum failed, the lack of bipartisanship being the key one. But anyone involved in the campaign could see there was a real onslaught of racism unleashed during this campaign that was highly damaging for the people involved and for the country. The role that disinformation played, if you vote yes to this, Indigenous people will be able to take your house. If you vote yes to this, you'll have to pay rent to Indigenous people. If you vote yes to this, your business might have to give free stuff away to Indigenous people. Like these were claims that were shared. Again, I'm not saying that...
And repeated back on the doors and the phones as well. When I was making calls, I was getting their key lines back at me from voters. Like I was like, oh my God, this is working.
Yep. So last year the referendum gave us an insight into the state of our democratic health, and it's not a pretty picture, I don't think. So we should be really reflecting on that as policy people, as campaigners, and as people who want to, in the future, achieve progressive reform. How are we going to do that? How are we going to better combat disinformation in the digital age? How are we going to better deal with racism? Because those two things were entwined, right? Racism was like the fuel that made the lies travel. All those examples of disinformation that I just mentioned, they're all kind of dog whistles, but dog whistles issued in the age of social media, which are sort of even more, travel even faster and further. So I think efforts at advancing Indigenous rights are going to be hard. This certainly opened up the culture wars. This certainly made the reconciliation movement go backwards in that respect, as you mentioned. So we've got a lot of work to do as a country. I really do think that, because if we can't put partisanship and petty politics aside at crucial moments for our national, for the nation's good, then we have a real problem in this country. It shouldn't all just be base petty politics and everything is fair game. This should have been a moment where politicians of both sides were able to work together and rise above that in order to shepherd the country through a healthier debate. And we failed miserably at that task.
The bigger question, obviously, is this notion of trying to amend the Constitution. You noted before, 8 out of 44, only 8 out of 44 constitutional...
45 now.
Sorry, 45, yes, you're right, 45 referendums have passed. I think like if you're in baseball, that would be a batting average of 180, which is well under the Mendoza line for all the baseball nerds out there. The folks at the ARN, the Australian Republican movement, must be looking at this going, well, what's the point? Like, I just think it's too hard. Like the way that our founding fathers, and they all were blokes, structured to alter the Constitution. It's not easy winning a union ballot nowadays because of the way that union BComs and union secretaries set up their unions. It is impossible to run a ticket against an incumbent union, and it's intentionally designed that way. And I think that the Founding Fathers intentionally designed the way that we want to alter the Constitution is almost designed to make it impossible to get it to pass. And I just want to get, from a constitutional law perspective, why would you do this? Why would you bother just playing in this field? Because it's just impossible to get something up. If you literally ran a question like, do you never ever want to alter the Constitution? Vote yes. Everyone, people. I think no one's going to say yes to anything. It's impossible to get it up now. You have to frame it in a way that's kind of idiosyncratic, like it's the opposite of what you wanted to do, and they might go against it. Then you accidentally get it up. That's the only way I can conceive of you actually creating constitutional change. Otherwise, it's just too tall an ask. Anyway, I'm rambling, but that was my biggest takeaway from it. Was like, don't bother. Just don't bother doing this anymore. This is stupid. This is just a waste of money.
Well, I think it's got to be bipartisan, right? Only if both sides agree that the change needs to be made will you then have some chance of convincing a majority of voters in a majority of states and a majority nationally that it should be done. Because that's really the only way to minimise the division and the naysayers. And even then, it's not a guarantee because there'll still be people out there arguing no, and it still might not pass, right? Two ideas that I propose in the book. One is that there should have been a negotiation process, like some kind of proper negotiation process where Indigenous leaders could sit down with politicians, Liberals, Nationals, Labor, Greens, everybody, Teals, and nut out a way forward if possible, I think we need to be exploring those kinds of creative mechanisms to build political consensus much more. And the other idea that I think about is mini publics. How could we have taken this conversation away from just political elites in the same way that the Indigenous dialogues really enabled the Indigenous community to forge and grow consensus behind the idea of a voice? The coalition, after the Uluru Statement was issued, should have instigated some kind of broader public deliberative process, public dialogues, where those Indigenous people proposing a voice could have sat down with members of the Australian public, to talk about their idea, flesh it out, collaboratively draft it, whatever, to help take this out of that partisan political fray, get people more involved. And that should have happened, particularly since it was polling at around 60% at that time, right? We, as a country, we haven't explored those kinds of mechanisms nearly enough. And you can look at the way mini publics are used in Ireland as an example of how it can work, particularly if the participants of the mini publics are randomly selected rather than politically selected, as was the case with the Republic Constitutional Convention, right? Because, during the debate, the Liberals were saying, we need to have a constitutional convention. Well, one, why didn't you guys run a convention during the 9 years you were in power? And two, convention did nothing for the Republic.
Yeah.
It consolidated and amplified division. It did not build Republican consensus, didn't build bipartisanship, didn't help the Republic succeed. Why? I think because politically selected participants meant it was just all about political egos. It was about Turnbull versus Abbott and driving forward their political careers. It wasn't about truly building broad consensus. So if there's ways to design processes that take it out of the political and the partisan and engage ordinary members of the public, team them up with legal experts and whoever else, I think those are the kinds of processes we need to be looking at to have any hope of forging ideas for constitutional reform that enjoy wide support and therefore that might have a chance of winning broad public support.
Look, to your second point, as a community organiser, I know I am biased in this practice, but a lot of change that we can make in our society is through the practice of organising our constituencies. And that is where I think we need to spend more time doing this work and not getting transfixed and focused on social media and thinking that that's the silver bullet that I either can win or kill a campaign. I think it's actually, we need to talk. We just continue to need to talk to our neighbours about this stuff and bring them on a journey and enable them to be a part of that shared purpose. So, Shireen, thank you so much for your time on the show today. Don't forget, everyone, please go out and buy a copy of her book. It's called Broken Heart, A True History of the Voice Referendum. We have 2 copies that we're going to give away. If you want a copy, you need to subscribe to Social Democratic on Patreon. And the first 2 that do that and just write in the chat, or I don't know how Patreon works, to be honest, but write some note for Rebecca that says, I want one of the books, then we'll send 2 of those copies out to those 2 wonderful listeners. Shireen, thanks very much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate your time. Good luck with all the other work you're doing at the new Radical Centre.
The Radical Centre Reform
Lab. Great name. I like it as Radical Centre because I guess it's like centre as an organisation, but it sounds like you're talking about a radical centre. Like we're going to be in the centre of politics and be quite radical.
No, that's what it is. It's the Radical Centre. Yeah, it's how do you bring together left and right? Inspired by this journey that I've been on. It's all about how do you transcend these ideological divides, and that's a question we have to keep asking. But Stephen, thanks so much for having me. It's been awesome to talk to you today.
Wonderful. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And to get all the latest on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.